Thank you very much. I guess I have an auxiliary magnification system here. It's an honor to address this very vibrant association and to be in Egypt. I want to argue that we should interpret economic development as equalization of opportunities. It's not just something that we'd like to have, but it should be our conception of economic development. So how is economic development classically measured? It's measured as GDP per capita. And then what's the normative justification of this? Well, it's the following, that we conceive of individual welfare as being the income of a person, Y sub I, and then we take social welfare to be the average welfare of all individuals, which is to say their average income. That's GDP per capita. And this measure can be criticized in two ways. The first is that welfare is linear in income, which ignores the fact that some needs are more urgent than others. So the first few dollars of income you get is much more important to you than the last few dollars. And secondly, social welfare is conceived of as utilitarian, that is to say simply the sum of the incomes, and reflects no concern for inequality among individuals. Now you might argue that I'm wrong to say that GDP per capita is a measure of social welfare. Really, it's a measure of technological sophistication or industrial capacity of the society. But I claim that economic development must mean the advance of human society. It can't be just a technological concept. A productive technology run by slaves, all of whose product goes to a small elite, should not be considered a highly developed economy. So I insist on the justification of an index of economic development that's corollary to a concept of social welfare. Equality of opportunity. The distribution, the idea here is that the distribution, and I'm here amplifying on what the last speaker, Mark, described for you very briefly. The distribution of the social objective, which is here income, should be independent of circumstances, beyond the control of the individual, but may reflect actions that are under their control. Leveling the playing field is often a metaphor that's used to describe equalizing opportunity, and it means compensating persons for the effect on their achievements which reflect disadvantages beyond their control. So the troughs in the playing field are these disadvantages, and that's what we want to level out. Here's the language that I use. Circumstances are those aspects of a person's environment that influence outcomes and are beyond the person's control. In particular, his family background would be a very important circumstance. The typology is the partition of the population into types, where a type consists of all persons who have similar circumstances. Within a type, outcomes will differ, let's say the achievement of income, because people will exert different amounts of effort. So there'll be a distribution of income within each type. So here's an example from data for Austria in 2005. What is graphed here are three cumulative distribution functions of income for various young men. The young men who have the CDF function in blue are the ones whose parents did not finish high school. So the single circumstance which I'm focusing upon here is the level of education of one's parents. The red CDF is the distribution of income of young men whose parents finished high school but had no tertiary education. And the yellow CDF is the distribution of income of young men whose parents had at least some tertiary education. And just to remind you how to read this CDF, let me see if I can find it again. let's say we take 30,000 euros. Oops, this is not happy. Okay, if we take 30,000 euros, this says that if you look at the blue curve, if you look at the blue curve, about 90% of people had income less than 30,000 in that type, but only about 60% of people in the yellow type had income below 60,000. So obviously the blue type are generally poorer than the yellow and red types. And remember, the only difference between these young men is in the education of their parents. That's a circumstance beyond their control, and hence we say that there are unequal opportunities here. The chances that you have of making a good income are clearly smaller if you come from parents who are poorly educated than if you come from parents who are well educated. The fact that there's a distribution of income among each of these types, we simply assign as a residual to everything else, which will include other circumstances, but it will also include what we're calling effort, which is how hard people try. So here, let's contrast these three distribution functions for Austria with two other countries. On the top, we have Denmark, and you see here in Denmark, there's very little inequality of opportunity in the sense that these three distribution functions of income are very, very close together. In fact, there's very little difference between the income distribution of young men whose parents just had 12 years of education and those who had some college. The bottom two, the more right-hand two distribution functions are virtually coincident. And then a country where there's more or less equality of opportunity, on the bottom is Hungary. And here you see that the income distributions are very far apart. These data are all from 2005. Now I'm going to show you we can do this for many other countries. The only question is whether we have the data. I was in Uganda 2 years ago and I did some work there and I constructed these curves. Here the blue curve are incomes of people whose parents had no primary school or incomplete primary school. The red graph are young men whose parents had who had completed primary school, and the green graph are the distribution function of income of young men whose parents had some post-primary school. Quite a lot of inequality of opportunity. And here are some other graphs. So the bottom graph here looks at regions. Here we have the income distribution of people in the 4 different regions of Uganda. And you can see the northern region is by far the least developed in the sense that the income distribution of those people is worse. Here the type is simply the region of the country you live in. And the most developed region is the central region, which contains the capital, Kampala. Let me show you inequality of opportunity in Brazil, because there's a kind of interesting thing here. So here we have 3 distribution functions. Again, income of young men, people in their 30s and early 40s. The green group, let me start with the red group. The red group, who are the most advantaged, are people who come from, children who come from households which were led by a white man and lived in the city. White male urban households. The blue group is white female head of households, urban, and the green group is male white head of households, rural. So it's actually better to come from a family that's led by a woman, who the household head is a woman in the city, than to come from a male head of household in the country. Now I want to contrast this to the same 3 distribution functions, but not for white people, but for people of mixed race, which means, Indian, white, black mixtures. Here are the 3 distribution functions. They look very much the same. And now I'm going to impose these 6 distribution functions on the same graph, and we get this. What do we have? We have absolute dominance, what's called first-order stochastic dominance, of all 3 mixed race distribution functions. Again, these are the children from mixed race families. and the 3 whites. There's perfect stochastic dominance. The three bottom curves are all associated with the whites, and the 3 top curves are all associated with the mixed. Now, the final part of the story is to look at black head of households. I'm sorry, this is not the children. These are the householders themselves, these graphs. So these are the distribution functions of men in households in these 3 kinds of households. Now the blacks are in yellow, and it's kind of hard to see them, but the interesting thing is, see if I can point it out to you, if I can get this pointer working. Okay, so these bottom 3 are the whites. These next 3, red, blue, and green, are the mixed, and the yellows are almost coincident with the 3 mixed. Actually, the female head of households, black, are slightly better off than the mixed head of households, rural. But otherwise, there's very, very little difference between the distribution functions of the blacks and the mixed. So what this shows is there's definitely inequality of opportunity with respect to white versus non-white in Brazil, but it seems as if there's no special discrimination against blacks as opposed to mixed race people. And I think that's probably, it's often said that Brazil is not racist, and then other people say, well, it is. Well, we can see both things. It is racist in the sense that there's lower equality of opportunity for non-whites, but it's non-racist in the sense that there's no special inequality of opportunity directed to blacks as opposed to mixed, at least according to these graphs. Now I want to argue that economic development is equity, that it should be conceived of as equity, not as GNP per capita. In the World Development Report in 2006, which was called Equity and Growth, it's an excellent report. It was edited by François Bourguignon, who talked at the first talk. But I believe it suffers from a confusion of implicitly assuming that development is measured by GDP per capita and counterposing this with equity conceived of as equality of opportunity. And I want to argue that those are the same thing, so you really can't have 2 different measures for them. And I'll give a couple of quotes to illustrate this view. Here's one. Greater equity is thus doubly good for poverty reduction through potential beneficial effects of aggregate long-run development and through greater opportunities of poorer groups in society. Well, what does this mean? Greater aggregate long-run effects. Greater aggregate long-run effects means long-run development has to mean growth of GDP. The second phrase, greater opportunities for poorer groups, that's saying it's good in itself to have more opportunities. But my point is, these are not 2 different things. We should simply conceive of economic development as greater equality of opportunity and not desire it because it increases GDP per capita, but desire it as an end in itself. Here's another example. If the opportunities faced by children like N are so much more limited than those faced by children like P or S, and if this hurts development progress in the aggregate, then public action has a legitimate role in seeking to broaden opportunities. What does it mean to say, and if this hurts development progress? It means, and if it slows down the rate of growth of GDP. Otherwise, it's a tautology, right? That if some people have fewer opportunities than others, that is hindering development if development's defined as equalization of opportunities. And here it's also arguing that the legitimacy of development policies has to be justified by their effect on GDP growth. I disagree with that. It has to be justified by their effect on equalizing opportunities. The conventional dynamic measure of economic development is growth of GDP per capita. In its place, I propose growth of the average income of the most disadvantaged type. Those are the people with whom we're concerned. So what would we like to do if we advocate economic equalization of opportunities? We'd like to press these distribution functions together. I mean, ideally, if there were the same distribution function for each of these types of person, there'd be no inequality of opportunity. There'd still be inequality of outcome. We do have a distribution of income, but that we attribute to effort. Now, as I said, this is a very crude typology I've taken. It's one with just one circumstance. We'd like to actually include many more circumstances. Brazil actually is pretty good because it has urban versus rural in it. That's a circumstance. We'd also maybe like to include the number of children in the family, the IQ of the individuals, which is something beyond his control, which will affect his future accomplishments, whether the family was a single parent or a multi-parent family. There are all these circumstances that we'd like to include. This is a crude first cut that just takes a couple of circumstances as defining type. So if we look at the real GDP in the United States in the period since 1975, we see that it's grown quite a bit. That's the red line. But the real median household income is the blue line, and it's been basically flat in real terms. So this shows, and this recapitulates a point that Francois made when he was talking about distribution of income in various countries, that the income growth has not gone to the average person in the United States. It's gone primarily to the rich, and therefore looking at GDP per capita gives a very misleading view of economic development. You might say that the bottom line is more associated with the idea that opportunities for average people have not improved very much over this period, even though GDP per capita has gone up quite smartly. Let's compare the United States to France. During the period 1975 to 2006, average income in France grew by only 27%, whereas in the United States it grew by 85%. So if you looked at just GDP per capita, you'd say US has done a lot better than France for its people during that period. However, if you now exclude the incomes of the top 1% of households in both countries, it turns out that in the US income distribution, the bottom 99% of people their income grew by only 17.9%, while the incomes of the bottom 99% in France grew by 26%. Now it looks as if France was doing better for its people, and I think that's actually the correct conclusion. So much of the income increase in the United States in the last 30 years has gone to the top 1% of the income distribution. In fact, in the years 2010 through 2013, the last 3 years, 95% of the income growth in the United States went to the richest 1% of households. And that single fact is what created or what induced the Occupy movement in the United States. They weren't kidding when they said that the growth has been totally skewed towards the very richest households in the population. If you look at financial wealth, these are Lorentz curves of various kinds of income and wealth in the United States. The green curve is the Lorentz curve for income. And you remember the Gini coefficient is basically the fraction of the area of the triangle, which is between the diagonal and the Lorentz curve. Sorry, I missed that. So here, this is the Lorentz curve for income. This blue curve is the Lorentz curve for financial wealth. The red curve is the financial curve for all wealth. Let's look at all wealth. If you look at 50%, this says that 50% of the wealth in the United States is owned by about I'm sorry, this says that, so what does this say? 50% of the people own about 5% of the wealth. Right? This is the fraction of people who own various amounts of wealth. this is the level of wealth. So there's an extremely skewed wealth distribution. If you look at financial wealth, 50% of the people own about 2% of the financial wealth in the United States. So it's a highly, highly skewed society in terms of distribution. This is the main characteristic, of course, of a class society. Here are the Lorentz curves for various countries. Again, the bottom red one is the United States. This is wealth. The countries which are the most equal, in the sense that their Lorentz curves are closest to the diagonal, are Japan and China. Even China still has a Lorentz curve which is pretty good. They have created a lot of wealth at the very top, but they've also raised 300 million people from poverty, so that compared to other countries, China is still looking pretty good. France is this country here that's about in the middle of this dispersion, with the two blue lines are France. The green country is India. So we see that the U.S. has by far the most inegalitarian wealth distribution among these countries. As I said, Japan and China have the most egalitarian distributions. Wealth, however, is building up in a very unequal way in China, and the Lorentz curve for 2013 would probably look much less egalitarian than this one does, which I think was 2008. So in conclusion, equality of welfare is an ethic which instructs us to raise the economic position of those who are the most disadvantaged by circumstances beyond their control in society. A fairly accurate way of identifying this group is by looking at the education and income of the parents of the individuals. Of course, in some countries, race and ethnicity are also very relevant dimensions of type. The most disadvantaged adults in a class society are very closely related with those whose parents were poor or who had poor education. And in my view, the task of economic development is to end that bias. Development policies should focus on raising the economic positions of this group. This means what? Focusing on raising primary education school completion rates, not on tertiary education, which benefits almost always those only from the most advantaged groups. Secondly, focusing on universal access to health care, especially with an emphasis on diseases that affect the poor, malaria and contagious diseases. Third, provision of clean water and adequate housing for most of the disadvantaged. Fourth, income support for poor families to enable them to send their children to school and not to work. Fifth, special emphasis on the education of girls. Sixth, state programs to counteract predatory private credit markets, which are the only ones the poor have access to in most countries. Seventh, financing transfers to the poor through sharply progressive taxation of the rich. The opposition to these policies will come from the rich and the advantaged middle classes. One of the most pernicious ideas that has gained prominence in the last 30 years is that high tax rates on the rich discourage and innovate development. This is simply a big lie. The work of Thomas Piketty has shown that, and others, has shown that top tax rates on the rich should actually be much higher. Piketty, Saez, and Stanchikova, in a recent paper, calculated that the optimal tax rate on those who earn $1 million or more on the United States, optimal in the sense of raising the maximum revenue from this group, is over 80%. But the top tax rate that currently exists on this group is about 39%. And it's actually less if you take account of the fact that much of their income is from capital, which is taxed at yet a lower rate of 15%. So the rich are actually paying a very, very low tax rate compared to what they were paying in the golden age of American capitalism under Eisenhower and Kennedy in the 50s and early 1960s. Under Eisenhower, the top tax rate in the United States was 91%. top marginal tax rate. But that didn't seem to hurt economic development. It was lowered to 35% under George Bush, and now I think it's a little higher under Obama. So the rich proclaim through all their media and the think tanks which they finance and control that raising taxes will reduce innovation and there'll be less trickle down. Well, first of all, we've noticed there's been virtually no trickle down, at least in the United States, in the past 10 years. As I told you, 95% of the total gain in GNP went to the top 1% in the last 3 years. So there has been virtually no trickle down, and that holds even for the last 40 years. And secondly, I don't believe it's true that innovation will decrease if the rich are taxed at higher rates. After all, what are they going to do with their money? Are they going to cash it in and write poetry and play golf? Well, they already have enough time to play golf, and they're probably not any good at writing poetry. So you have to take account of what their alternatives are. Now, granted, there would be perhaps some capital flight, like Gérard Depardieu in France, a greedy movie star who said, I'm going to move to Belgium if you increase my taxes. There'll be some capital flight, but if we're talking about a normative exercise, and we say that we should tax capital incomes at a much higher rate internationally, then there's no place for them to flee with their capital. And it's not as if their work is so onerous and difficult that they would rather lie on the beach or play golf or write poetry. They get their pleasure from being masters of the world, from running big firms, from having control over a lot of people, from making important decisions, for running in a social clique that values them and thinks of them as important people. And none of that would change if we taxed them at a much higher rate, because everybody's income in those classes would go down. So it's simply a big lie that we can't increase taxes on the rich. It's a big lie which has been extremely carefully propagated in the last 40 years. As I say, the fall in the top rates is due to successful conservative political action and propaganda, not to economic rationality. The reasons taxes paid by the rich are low in developing countries is not due to economic rationality, but due to the fact that the wealthy control the political mechanism. That's it. And they do. The wealthy do control the political mechanism in virtually every country in the world. Remarkably, the same is true in the United States today. Removing the rich class from its position of absolute control of the political mechanism is the key task of the democratic transition. But democracy itself won't produce justice until it has eliminated inequalities of opportunity for the acquisition of income and wealth that are due to privilege, status, and all circumstances beyond the control of individuals. Thank you.